Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf Kaf Daled, Moadim L'Simcha. Today's daf is sponsored by Alana Kermeyer in loving memory of her father, Moshe Fox, Moshe Yehuda ben Harav Binyamin and Chayet Tzipora on his 7th year at site. I miss his smile, his chuckle, his humor, and his warmth more and more as the years go by. Okay, we're going to get started. We're going to finish up the issue of the Yoshev, and I'm going to go back and just kind of clarify something I may not have clarified in yesterday's daf, so I want to just be more specific about it. We started with the Yoshev Minalan. So we're again in our list of all the disqualifications. If a kohen is working, doing the avodah while he's sitting, the avodah is disqualified. The sacrificial work the sacrifice is ruined. So we had two different sources. First, we have Rav in the name of Rav Nachman who said la'amod l'sharet, la'amida b'charti v'lo l'yeshiva. That means the kohanim were chosen to stand, which means as soon as they don't stand, they're as if they're not chosen. That's why the Gemara in another minute is going to say, oh, well, then they must be like a zar, because they're like someone who wasn't chosen to work. That's everyone who's not a kohen. Then there's a second interpretation brought in a braita, which is because it says la'amod l'sharet and because it says ha'omdim, it says it twice. Twice means it's la'akev, shusi many times. That means it has to be done that way. But then we go back, Rava quoted Rav Nachman as saying, Lamida b'chativ, right? That you were chosen to stand, not to sit. So as soon as you sit, you're basically considered like a non-kohen. If that's the case, he says, well, if you're considered like a zar, and then your avodah is disqualified, well, then we have another question. If you're like a zar, you should be completely like a zar. And a zar who works in the temple gets punished by death. Why wouldn't the kohen who sits in the temple get punished by death? So in other words, this is all based on the first interpretation that you're chosen to be standing. And if you're not standing, you're not chosen anymore. You're basically like a zar. To which we explained, first of all, we then said there was a braita that says you don't get the death penalty. So again, death would be by death by the hands of God, but you don't even get that because it says specifically, Arel onen yoshev enam b'mita alabas hara. To which they answered, and this we saw in the previous daf, and this we're going to move on to the new daf, which is the mechusar begadim and lo rachutz yadayim v'raglayim. If you didn't wash your hands or you're not wearing the kohen clothes, then it says in the psukim by each of those that you're going to get death. It says umetu, okay, you're going to die. So those are two ktuvim, and two ktuvim ba'im kechad melamdim. That's this principle that if something's written once, we can use it as a paradigm for many other things. But if something's written in two different places, then already it means just here, nowhere else. And that's why the Yoshev doesn't say they get death, and we can't learn it from Zar because it's written in two other places that there's two people who get death. And from there, we learn only those, not anyone else. But but if you say two places, you could still get the death penalty. So what are you going to say then? I'm sorry, two places you could still learn to other places, which means theoretically the Yoshev could get killed by the hands of God. Well, but someone who drinks comes into the temple drunk. Also, there it says, right? Right, and then so you won't die, meaning you'll die if you come in drunk and do the sacrificial work while you're drunk. So in this case, there's three psukim. Three psukim, everyone agrees. Once it says it three times for sure, it means only here, nowhere else. And with that, we end the section. The next part of the Mishnah talked about a chatzitza between the kohen and the floor. Kohen has to stand directly on the floor. And if he's, according to the Mishnah, omer al gabe kelim, standing on vessels, or al gabe behema, on an animal, or al gabe raglei chavero, or standing on his friend's feet, pasul. So if the kohen is standing on any one of those things while he's doing the work is disqualified. Minalan, where do we get this from? Ditana debe Rabbi Yishmael, ho'il uritzpa mikadeshet, u'klei sharet mikadshim, ma klei sharet lo yehe davar chotzetz beino levein klei sharet, af ritzpa lo yehe davar chotzetz beino levein ritzpa. So they make a comparison between the floor and the sanctified vessels. Now, I read it in one way. There's actually two different ways to read this, whether it's mikadeshet or mikudeshet. I'll explain them both in a minute. So let's read it first as mikadeshet. The floor can sanctify things, as well as sanctified vessels can sanctify things, right? We've learned that when you put something in the sanctified vessel, it makes it sanctified, okay? That's what a sanctified vessel does. So there's many things that end up going into these sanctified vessels in order to make them sanctified for use in the temple. Also, the floor can sanctify. How is that? So we learned that if you put, there's certain opinions that you can, if you put not opinions, but if you put something on the floor, then and you burn it on the floor rather than on the altar, it's accepted. Okay, it's like being put on the altar, even though you're supposed to put it on the altar, but you could theoretically. So that has the same powers, so to speak, or sanctification capabilities as the vessels. And just like a vessel, when you hold it, there can't be any sort of separation, interposition between your hand, let's say, and the vessel. Also, there can't be anything separating between you and the feet and the klei sharet. But there's a different explanation that's mikudeshet. It is sanctified. Not that it sanctifies things, but it is sanctified. And the klei sharet are sanctified. And then that's just another interpretation. Okay, next we get to why the Mishnah needed to say all three things. Because could have just said, you're standing on a vessel. End of story. So why do I have to say standing on a vessel, standing on an animal, standing on your friend's feet? Utsricha, they're needed. Why? If you'd said vessel, you'd say, okay, mishum delav mina de basal minu. That's for sure an interposition because a person's body, flesh, and a vessel are two completely different things, which means it would create an interposition. But maybe if you're stepping on an animal, which is also flesh, right? So you have, body of person on body of animal, maybe that's one type of thing, and therefore it's not considered an interposition. It's just, you're on something that's the same as you, so it sort of blends in and it's not really an interposition. Therefore, you needed to say also be'ema. Now, yesh mina be'ema, de lo mina de adam. What's the chiddush of adding also you're stepping on your friend's feet? Because you could still say an animal is different than a human. Right? An animal body is not the same as a human body. Maybe it's more similar to a utensil, but it's not. Right? But it's definitely different than another human body. So therefore, they needed to tell you, aval chavero de adamu emalo. You might have thought another person, foot on foot, maybe is an interposition. And that's why they needed to give you all three cases. Now we're going to have a braita and then a question about another case, which is going to talk about unique cases relating to this issue of chatzitza. Tanya, Rabbi Eliezer Omer. So first we're going to bring a braita with Rabbi Eliezer's position. Raglo achat ala klif, raglo achat ala ritzpa. Sounds like a bit like a Rabbi Yirmiyah question, but it's said in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, right? The Tana. What if you have one, maybe he said this too early, if it had gotten to Rabbi Yirmiyah before it was said, maybe Rabbi Yirmiyah would have asked it. But raglo achad ala kliv, raglo achad ala ritzpa. One foot is on the vessel and one foot is on the ground. So here you have an interposition with one of your feet, but one of your feet is directly on the ground. Is that sufficient? Or raglo achad ala even, raglo achad ala ritzpa. Okay, this is just kind of the same. One is on a utensil, one is your foot is on a stone, but the other's on the ground. So what's the explanation here? What's the law? Rabbi Eliezer says, Rowan, we assess the situation. Kol she'ilu yinatel hakli v'tinatel ha'even yachol la'amod reglo achat v'yavod avodato kshera v'im lav avodato psula. They say, well, let's see. If we took away the stone or the vessel, would the person be able to balance on one foot and do the avoda? I'm thinking of like a Cat in the Hat book, right, where he's got the stuff in his hand and the blood in the cup and the foot on the ground on one foot. Can he do it? Okay, which I guess this depends on the capability of the kohen, how good his balance was. Did he prepare with some yoga before? So that's the question. If he could balance on one foot, then basically there's no chatzitza because he's standing on the ground and that one foot is giving him solid ground. But if he can't balance on one foot and do what he's supposed to do, which is probably more likely, then we're going to consider this a chatzitza. Okay, next. By Rabbi Ami. Rabbi Ami asked, what if the stone on the ground of the temple was loose? Okay, and then the kohen stands on it. Now, is that considered the ground, the floor? Or, by the way, flashback, Shuli Mishkin of this week wrote about the floor of the temple. And based on some excavations they found, also perhaps thinking about what might have been on the ground of the temple, there's an interesting article about the floor of the temple, so recommended reading. In any case, Rabbi Ami asks, if the stone was loose, and then you stood on that mahu. So now we have to figure out what this question is. Because we're going to see, if they don't plan to put the stone back into the ground, then for sure it's a chatzitza, it's no longer part of the ground. The question was, if you're planning to put it back in the ground and you just haven't fixed it yet, but it's loose, mai. So his question is, since you plan to put it back in, do we view this as if it's attached to the ground already? Or do we say, well, right now it's detached, so it's considered separate from the ground, in which case, if you're stepping on it, it's not, your avoda is disqualified. So that was Rabbi Ami's question, version 1. Now we're going to have version 2 of Rabbi Ami's question, and either which way, we're going to end with a teku, we don't have an answer. Rabbi Zute Ba'elahachi. So Rabbi Zute had a different version of his question. By Rabbi Ami, that Rabbi Ami asked the following: Ne'ekra ha'even v'ama bimkoma mahu. If the stone was taken out and you stood in the place where the stone had been, so you're standing in a lower part of the floor. Okay, so there's this kind of hole in the ground, and you're standing in that hole. Ma, what's the halacha? So now they say, "Mai kamibayle." Again, what's the question here? Ki kaddish David ritzpa el yona kaddish. When David sanctified the floor, did he sanctify the upper floor, meaning the stone floor or whatever it was made of? O dilma adla arita toma kaddish, or did he sanctify all the ground below it as well? So now, if that's the question, okay, is the kedusha just on the tiles, the stone, the marble, whatever the floor was made of? Or does it go deeper, right, into the ground underneath? But if that's the question, then the question shouldn't have asked if one stone is taken out of place and the kohen stands there. He should have asked, he should have asked if the whole floor is uprooted and someone's standing on the ground. So that doesn't make sense if that was his question. To which they're going to answer, which, by the way, then has nothing to do with chatzitza. You follow? If we say that's the question, it has to do with the kedusha of the ground in the temple. Is it in the ground itself, or is it on the floor? Okay, whatever the floor is made of, which in this case we're talking about stone. But then they're going to say that's not the question, because then the wording of his question doesn't make sense. He should have said if the whole floor is taken out, because it's really a question about the whole floor. In which case they're going to explain the question differently, which is also not going to have to do with an interposition, a chatzitza. Lo'olam pshita le da'ad arite toma kaddish. For sure, the whole thing is sanctified, even underground. So, go down. This is like how Tuma goes up, right? This is the sanctity goes down all into the depths. But hacha kamabaile, the question is, okay, now try to imagine the situation. You have a nice floor, and then there's a big gaping hole in the floor. And the kohen specifically is standing there when he does the avoda. So the question here is, derech sherupakach? Oh, ain't derech sherupakach. Is that appropriate to do the avoda, specifically stand in the hole where there's an empty, spot in the floor? It doesn't seem like that's respectful. Or not. Or maybe it's fine. Teku. And we end without an answer. So in the end, so what we did here was we started with a braita of Rabbi Eliezer, who basically talked about this situation of 1 foot on, 1 foot off, and basically the balancing issue. Then we got to this question of Rabbi Ami, which we thought one had to do with this chatzitza issue, right? The first one for sure did, which is if the oven was taken out, is it a chatzitza or not if it's not put back in? If you're planning to put it back in, but it's not yet in. And the second is the issue of the is it appropriate to stand in the gaping hole in the floor? And then it has nothing to do with chatzitza. Next sugya. Kibel b'smol pasul v'Rabbi Shimon machshir. This is the end of the Mishna, where there's this machloket, right? In all the cases we said, does this, disqualified, disqualified, disqualified. Now we're going to talk about doing things with your left hand. Okay, and for this, there's Din and Daf, super interesting and also relevant to Sukkot, about taking a lulav, right? We always put the lulav in the right hand with the hadassim on the right, because the most important go on the right. That's what goes in the left hand. And the lulav is more important because it has all the different parts on it, as opposed to the etrog, which is just one. And then the hadassim go on the right. And then what if you're left-handed? Okay, so the sugya, today we're really not going to talk about left-handed people, although I guess if someone's doing it with their left hand, it's probably because they're lefty. So the question is, which areas of halacha, and Alana talks about very interesting distinctions here about doing things with your left hand. I see, Terry, you're asking about how you stand this gaping hole. Maybe I didn't describe well. It's not a gaping hole. It's just the top of the floor is missing, right? The tile. Imagine a tile is taken out, and there's the ground underneath. It's just dirt, right? Soil underneath. So that's the situation. You could be standing there. It's just a matter of is that appropriate or not. Okay. So now So if you want to know about left-handed people in halacha and which halachot, right? There's all sorts of halachot we do with the right hand. What do lefties do? I'm lefty myself. Very interesting topic. Anyway, you can listen to Din and Daf. Now we're going to go to our sugya. Kibel b'small pasul v'Rabbi Shimon machshir. So the first part of our sugya is going to be why specifically in Kabbalah is there a machloket about left. If you do it with your left hand, is it acceptable? This is the collecting of the blood, where again the kohen, one kohen, or someone could not be, it doesn't have to be a kohen, is slaughtering the animal. Kohen stands there and collects the blood into a vessel, okay, a klei sharet. Is the kohen, what if he does it with his left hand? Is the work going to be disqualified? Chamim say yes. Rabbi Shimon says no. Tana Rabbanan. So we're going to have a braita. It's going to show where we get this from a pasuk, and then we're going to have to figure out what's the machloka between them. What's the basis? So be'etzba'o v'lakach doesn't really say that in a pasuk, but here's the pasuk. It's Vayikra chapter 4, verse 25. V'lakach kohen midam chatat. We're talking about the sin offering. The kohen takes from the blood of the sin offering. Be'etzba'o. He takes it with his finger. This is after the slaughtering. He takes the blood with his finger. And then he puts it with his finger on the corners of the altar. Now, it doesn't mention Kabbalah in this pasuk, but there are two verbs. One is vilakach, he takes the blood, and the other is he puts it. So v'natan is for sure zrika. Well, what they're going to understand is vilakach must be Kabbalah, because there's shchita before. There's no word that says, and he accepted the blood, but it must be. He took the blood, meaning he accepted the blood in the kli. So lakach is the Kabbalah. Natan is the zrika. So we have the two main pulot here with the word etzba'o in the middle. Okay? Now, it says, so here when they say be'etzba'o v'lakach, what they see is where it says v'lakach be'etzba'o. He took it with his finger. Milamed shalote Kabbalah ela biyamin. From here you learn that the Kabbalah happens, so they assume v'lakach is Kabbalah, has to happen with your right hand. Okay, how do they get from etzba'o to right? Well, because in the Metzora, the leper, it says that the kohen takes his right finger. It says right next to finger, okay? Etzba'o yamanit. From there, we're going to see also there's a different place in the leper process where it talks about where the kohen they put blood and then they put oil on the finger. Okay, boen yado hayamanit. Their yad also hand goes with yamani. So in the leper, there's etzba that goes with yamani and hand that goes with yamani. So we're going to get back to this gzera shava that compares yad. Anytime, right, when we see yad, it's going to be yamani. When we see etzba, it's going to be yamani, right? So now they say, okay, it says be'etzba'o. So again, it doesn't say right, but it says etzba'o. V'lakach. So etzba'o goes with the Kabbalah. And from there we learn Kabbalah has to be with your right hand. And by the way, because etzba'o comes in between the two verbs, and if I asked you about the pasuk, what it means, right, you would say you use your finger for the whole thing, because it says, lakacha kohen midam chatat be'etzba'o. V'natan, how did natan with etzba'o, right? The etzba was obviously used for both. He takes the blood with his finger, puts it on with his finger. Okay. So from there, now we're going to talk about this. He doesn't really take the blood with his finger. The Kabbalah is done in this klei sharet, which you would have to hold in your hand. That's going to be a little bit of a question. But anyway, let's just view it very simply. The word etzba is in between these two verbs. It must go with both. And since etzba is with your right, also this is with your right. And you're asking about the ear. Yeah, it goes on his ear and his toe also, but that's not relevant for our purposes. Although we will end with that today. Okay, so now that's with the leper, if that wasn't clear what I was just saying about the ear. So now they say, that's Tanakama. You need Kabbalah and you need a Tinah to be with your right hand. I'm a Rabbi Shimon, and this is a very unclear statement. We're going to have 3 different explanations what he means here. So don't worry if you don't really understand it yet. V'chine emra ya b'Kabbalah. Does it say hand in Kabbalah here? No, hand doesn't mention the pasuk at all, right? Ela be'etzba'o v'natan shelo te'en tina ela biyamin. So he says, okay, again, let's just start out with this question. Does it say Kabbalah? Does it say Yad by Kabbalah? No. It says etzba goes with the word vinatan, which is the zrika, sprinkling. Shalote netina ela biyamin. So etzba goes with the end of the pasuk, okay, with that second verb. Ho'il v'lo nemra ya b'Kabbalah, and because it doesn't say hand in Kabbalah by the accepting of the blood, kibel b'smol kashir. Therefore, the Kabbalah is done with the left hand, it's okay. It's a very unclear, why did he bring hand into the picture? We don't know. So Rabbi Shimon, now they start asking, Mima nafshach. Either way, he doesn't really make any sense. Eat like Gzera Shava. If he has the Gzera Shava of, again, what's the Gzera Shava? They haven't really mentioned it yet. We're going to see it later, but it's that by the Mitzorah, by the leper, it has Yad, Yamin. It also has Etzba with his right hand. Okay, again, each one is different. The Yad Yamin is the leper's right hand, right? It's on the Boen Yado of his right hand, which is really his finger, but they call it Yad there. And the kohen puts his finger in the blood. There it says his right finger. Okay, so both. So that's one's the kohen, one's the leper. Either which way. Okay, there's this gzera shava. So if he holds by the gzera shava, kilone and Rabbi Yabba Kabbalah Mayahavi. What's the difference? Why would he say? Did it say yad in Kabbalah? We don't need yad. We need etzba because yad and etzba. There's a gzera shava with both. So why would he make a big deal that it didn't say yad in the pasuk? We still have etzba, which is kind of the same. So right, we get us to the same conclusion. If he lay like gzera shava, and if he doesn't hold by gzera shava, then why is he saying v'chinem raya b'kabbalah? Does it say hand there? Well, who cares if it says hand? It wouldn't tell you right because he doesn't have the gzera shava. Remember with gzera shava, there's either you have it or you don't, right? You have a tradition about it or you don't have a tradition. So if he holds by the gzera shava, then etzba should have been fine. And if he doesn't hold by the gzera shava, then what would have helped if there was yad there? Because remember, he said, does it say hand? No, it doesn't. It says etzba. So anyway, it doesn't really make sense. So first explanation. Okay, so again, I don't think I read the last words. Kinemra yad b'Kabbalah mahavi. What would it have helped if it said yad in Kabbalah? So Amar Rav Yehuda, lo alam late like Gzera Shava. The first explanation is say he doesn't know about the Gzera Shava. And hachi kamar, and this is what he said. V'chine emar yad yemanit b'Kabbalah. I was missing an important word. Did it say right hand in Kabbalah? No, it didn't say right in this pasuk at all. And since there's no Gzera Shava, so we have no way to learn that this would be your right hand. And since it doesn't say your right hand, it could have said your right finger, okay, but it doesn't say anything about any right hand. It probably says hand because Kabbalah is done with your hand. So it doesn't say right hand, and therefore kibel b'smol kasher. But there's going to be two difficulties with this explanation. We're going to end up with three explanations because the first two are going to be rejected. Two problems with this. Amarle Rabba, ihachi afilu nitinanami. Well, it doesn't say right by sprinkling of the blood, by the placing of the blood. It doesn't say right there either. So if it doesn't say right there, then why? And that's what's obvious is that Rabbi Shimon disagrees specifically about Kabbalah. He doesn't disagree. He thinks the sprinkling of the blood for sure has to be done with the right hand. Although we will suggest at the end of today's daf that perhaps not. But right now we assume that Rabbi Shimon thinks that he also that the sprinkling would have to be done with the right, and it doesn't say right about the sprinkling at all, or the placing of the blood. Ve'od. Okay, now remember, Rav Yehuda said he doesn't have a Gzera Shava, but that's not true. Because ve'od v'chilei leila Rabbi Shimon Gzera Shava, what, he doesn't hold the Gzera Shava? I'll quote you a braita where it's clear he holds by the Gzera Shava, and here we're going to see the Gzera Shava. V'hatanya Rabbi Shimon, kol makom shenemar yad, ena el yamin, etzba, ena el yamin. Rabbi Shimon says, if it says yad, it's yamin. If it says etzba, it's yamin. Now, he doesn't say Gzera Shava, but he obviously learns that from the Gzera Shava from the leper. How else would he get to that? So basically, that first answer is no good. Okay, second explanation. El Amarava. Lo olam eat like Gzera Shava. Okay, now we're on, obviously Rabbi Shimon does hold by the Gzera Shava. So what could his debate be then? If it says etzba, etzba would mean right. Well, hachi kamar. V'china emra ya b'Kabbalah. Ho'il v'lo ne'emra ya b'Kabbalah ela etzba, v'i efshar lekabel be'etzba, kibel b'smol kasher. The word etzba, now remember, the word etzba is in between the two verbs. Which verbs? V'natan, v'lakach, v'natan. Lakach, Kabbalah, v'natan, placing the blood. Now, which one can you do with your finger? Placing the blood. Which one can't be done with your finger? Catching the blood in a vessel. You need a hand to hold the vessel, maybe even two hands. At least one hand, not a finger. You can't really hold a vessel with your finger. So, since you can't hold the vessel with your finger, and it says finger in the pasuk, now here it makes perfect sense with this wording. Did it say yad? Now we understand why he's bringing a yad. For Kabbalah, you obviously need a hand. Didn't say hand. It said etzba. If it had said hand, we would have put that associated with it with catching the blood. And then collecting the blood. And then we would say, that needs yamin. We know from the Gzera Shava, it needs yad yamin. But this one, right, the etzba is clearly referring to the placing of the blood. this pasuk isn't referring to the collecting of the blood or the need for etzba, which is yamin, right? That's only going to be for the part where you could do it with your etzba. So the fact that it chose to use the word etzba in the pasuk and not yad shows that we're talking only about the need for the right hand is only in the placing of the blood, not in the accepting. However, this is also going to have a problem. Amar le Rav Sama Bered Rav Ashi le Ravina. Efshar da'avid le ozen l'sfat mizrak v'mekabel ba. You could actually hold a vessel with your finger. You could make like a rim and hold the rim, right? Put your finger under the rim, right? Or you think about a mug, you could theoretically, if you have a little handle there, you could put your finger in there, hold it with your finger, collect the blood. It's doable. So that doesn't prove anything. Third and final explanation here, Ela Amar Abaye, turning now to Amabet. B'mikra nidrash lefanav ulacharav kamiflagei. We have a very simple machloket. We have a word, etzba, which means right. Everyone accepts that. Rabbi Shimon also. But the question is, does that refer to the verb before, the verb after, or both? So that's what it means. Mikra nidrash lefanav ulacharav. When you have a word, you want to darshan. Do you connect it with the word before and the word after? According to the rabbis, yes. It connects both with the word before and with the word after. And that's why the etzba zimi, lakach is Kabbalah, natan is nitina zrika. That both verbs have to be done with the right hand only, okay? Both actions. But Rabbi Shimon says no. And it says etzba'o, it's really referring to the latter part of the pasuk. The mikra is nidrash lacharav, not lifanav. It doesn't go back to the verb before, it goes forward to the verb after. And therefore only the nitina has to be done with your right hand. Amar Abaye. Now Abaye just points out. So that's the machloket. Abaye points out, Hadran Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon. Now his son, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon's son, mafkamid avua, mafkamid Rabbanit. Doesn't agree with his father. Okay, kids always love to disagree with their parents. Doesn't agree with his father and doesn't agree with the rabbis. Meaning, in other simple terms, there's a third position. Ditanya, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon Omer, kama kam shenemar etzba b'Kabbalah. Now he's going to give a principle, like a rule. When it says etzba relating to Kabbalah, to the acceptance of the collecting the blood, shina b'Kabbalah pasul b'nitina kasher. If it says it specifically by Kabbalah, then we're going to say, if you did any sort of change, which means left-handed, you used your left hand, then it would be disqualified. But b'nitina, it would be kasher. Now he's basically, this is talking about our pasuk, we'll see that in a minute, but he means in our pasuk, the etzba goes with Kabbalah, not with zrika. He's going to obviously think that a pasuk, we'll see it in a minute, is darshan lifanav and not lacharav. Okay? We'll see that in a minute. Which is the opposite of Rabbi Shimon, who said it's lacharav and not lifanav, and it's different for the rabbis who says it goes in both. So he thinks that this pasuk etzba'o, it goes backwards. Lakach be'etzba'o, and then natan is separate. So nitina could be with any hand, but the Kabbalah has to be specifically with the right. And then he gives a different example, which is not our case. Shina b'nitina, sorry, I didn't read it. V'chol makom shneimar etzba b'nitina, and if it says etzba specifically by the placing of the blood, shina b'nitina pasul b'Kabbalah kasher. If you changed, right, if you did it with your left hand, in nitina it would be disqualified, Kabbalah would be okay. Hecha ne'emar etzba b'nitina. Now here they just bring the example of the etzba by the placing of the blood, by this, right, again, placing is a method of zrika. Tichtiv v'lakachta midam apal v'natata al karnot hamizbeach be'etzba'echa. Okay, this is the parchatat of the Miluim, when they did this consecration days of the temple. You're supposed to take from the dam, the blood of the par, of the bull, put it on the karnot hamizbeach be'etzba'echa. Now notice here, you can't, right? This is specifically talking about lakachta, natata, etzba. Instead of etzba being in between, it appears at the very end. So you have lakach, Kabbalah, you have nitina, placing, and then you have etzba. So they're going to say, oh, this clearly only refers to the nitina and not, don't jump too back. Okay, that's what we're going to say now. Kasavar mikra nidrash lifanav v'lo lifnei panav ulacharav. We darshan a pasuk, the word etzba goes to what's before it, which in that case is nitina, and in our pasuk it's Kabbalah, because it's right smack in the middle. And it's not nidrash lifnei panav, two verbs before. It doesn't jump back to the verb before that. So that's why in that second pasuk, it doesn't go back to the Kabbalah. But in our pasuk, right, it doesn't also go la'acharab. It doesn't go after. It only goes before. So in our pasuk, where it's smack in the middle, it goes back to the previous, which is Kabbalah, and not to Zrika. So we have three approaches here, and it's all based on this machloket of when you have a word that we're darshaning, to which verb does it go? The one before, the one after, or both? Okay? Now, I'm a Rabbi Bar Bar Chana. Now we're going to have a principle in general. Now we learned that etzba means right. So now comes Rabbi Bar Bar Chana in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Kol makom shneamar etzba. We now need a general principle. Every time it says etzba, ukehuna, and kehuna, meaning it has to be done by a kohen and with his finger, ena eli yamin. Now it sounds like, in the Gemara, meaning it has to be done with your right hand. Kasal kadatin tarte beina. Now when they first heard this, they thought he meant you need both. In order to require right, it has to have both that it says kohen in the pasuk, that kohen has to do it, and that it says etzba. Kidiftiv, like it says, v'lakacha kohen midam chata be'etzbo, like we just saw, right? Our pasuk. Lakacha kohen, he took midam chata be'etzbo. You have kohen, you have etzba. And then, how do we get from etzba? Now we're going to finally see this inside explicitly. V'yalach mi mitzorah. How do we know by mitzorah? What's the pasuk? Dichtiv v'tavala kohen et etzba'o yamani. The kohen dips his right finger. So there you have etzba kohen. It means has to be done with the right hand. And then we can learn from there to all sorts of other cases. To which they answer, but wait. Hare kmitza de lo ktiv bahu ela kiuna utnan kamatz b'smo pasul. But by kmitza, where the kohen takes his three middle fingers, right, puts them in, it just says kiuna. And we know that kamatz b'smol is pasul. So how can you say you need etzba and kiuna? That just says kiuna. Elama Rava, o etzba, o kiuna. So Rava says you misunderstood what they quoted Rabbi Yochanan is saying. It's either etzba or kiuna, meaning anything that requires a kohen has to be done with the right hand. Anything that requires an etzba, even if it doesn't say kohen, has to be done with the right finger. Amalei Abaye. Abaye says, that can't be true. Okay, you're going to say every time it says kohen has to do it, it has to be done with the right hand. I'll give you an example. When they would bring the parts of the korban olah to the altar to burn them, because everything gets burnt there, they cut the animal into parts, a little grotesque. Then the kohen takes, they have a slew of kohanim whose job it is to bring the parts of the animal to the altar. So the first kohen gets the most important. He takes the head of the animal, which is the most important, puts it in his right hand. Now, they didn't do each kohen carries only one thing. Everyone carried two things. So in his right hand, that's what we're going to get up to, right? In his left hand, he now takes in his left hand. That's the whole achat everim. Okay, let's read it inside. When he walks the parts of the animal to the altar, to the ramp of the altar, it says kiuna. So it says the kohen brings them all to the altar and then burns them on the altar. And they explain, what is this pasuk talking about? It's talking about walking the parts to the altar, because it just said he kriva kohen. What does it mean, kriv? It could mean sacrificed. It could mean, right? What it means here is he brought it close. We've said this before, that they try to figure out what the word kriv is. Sometimes it's Kabbalah. Anyway, it could mean different things. In this case, it's walking the parts of the altar. And what does it say? Utnan, the Mishna says, haregel shel yamin, the right foot of the right leg of the animal, bismolo, he carries in his left hand. Ubeit ora lachutz, that's just a side point, which is you keep not the cut side on the inside, so nobody sees where the cut is of the leg, and the hide on the outside, so it looks respectful. Anyway, the point being, this is an avoda that the kohen has to do. It says a kriva kohen, and he does it with his left, because remember, the head is in his right hand. So he carries the other one in his left hand. Now, if left was, every time it says kohen, it means left, this would be disqualified. So they're going to explain, now they're going to limit a little bit what Rabbi Yochanan said. When we said either etzba or kuna, we're talking about b'davar ma'akev kapara. This is a running theme. It's only in the items that affect atonement. Remember, as soon as you sprinkle the blood, your atonement is done. The burning of the parts on the altar happened after. That's already a later process if you're supposed to do it. But if you didn't do it, the korban is still accepted. So that's not what we're talking about. We're only talking about within the key essential rites. Have to be done where it says kohen, they all have to be done with the right hand. But something that doesn't, okay. And why do we get just Davar Makev Kapara, Dumia Demitzora, just like the leper? The leper, the parts that we talked about were the essential parts, right? The Kohen had to dip his finger to put the blood on the altar. So that clearly was part that was essential for the process. Now they're going to ask another question. Vare Kabbalah, Diftivu Kiuna, Udavar Makev Kaparau, Utnan, Kibel B'Smol Pasul, Rabbi Shimon Machshir. But wait, Kabbalah is Davar Makev Kapara, and Rabbi Shimon said it's kasher. So how do we explain Rabbi Shimon's position in light of that? To which they say, Rabbi Shimon tarte bai, he needs both. Okay, so that's the debate. Kabbalah, it says the kohen has to do it, but it doesn't say etzba. Remember, it said etzba, but we said the etzba, according to him, had to do with the sprinkling of the blood, not of the collecting of the blood. So rabbis hold you need either etzba or kohen, and in a davar ma'akev kapara, something that's essential. Then you would need the right hand. According to Rabbi Shimon, you need both. So if it says etzba and kohen, then then you would have to do it with the right hand. But now they ask, really? Mi bai Rabbi Shimon tarte v'hatanya. Rabbi Shimon omer, kol makom shneimar yad eno el yamin. Etzba eno el yamin. It says, if it says yad, if it says etzba, it's yamin. So it sounds like, we've quoted this before of Rabbi Shimon, it sounds like he doesn't need kohen. To which they answer, no, what he meant to say was, etzba lo baya kahuna, kahuna baya etzba. If you have the word etzba, you don't need anything more. It's clear because of the gzera shava from the leper that you need it to be with your right. But if you have the word kohen, it doesn't mean you have to do it with the right unless it's with the word etzba. And that's really not because you need the word kohen, but because the word etzba is there. Okay? So basically, the word etzba alone is what gives it to you, not the word kohen. Okay, that's according to Rabbi Shimon. So that's a debate. According to the rabbis, if it says the kohen does it, that already requires the right hand. So now they ask, Ela kohen lamali. So according to Rabbi Shimon, why do you need, now the Rush is, we're talking about the Pasuk, Krivu b'nei Aaron kohanim et Hadran, which is Kabbalah, right? And it says b'nei Aaron, it didn't need to say kohanim. Why does the word kohanim in that Pasuk? If not to tell you it needs to be done with the right hand, which is what the rabbis say, and he obviously doesn't think that. So what's he going to do with the word kohen? Biki who know what it means is they need to have their clothing on, their garments. If it's not with the garments, then it's a problem. Okay, which we learned already before. V'harei zrika deloktibu ela kiuna. But wait, now we have a problem. Zrika says kiuna only. V'tznan zarak b'smol pasul v'lo palig Rabbi Shimon. But wait a minute. Sprinkling of the blood only says, okay, now, this is tricky. Didn't we say sprinkling of the blood, according to Rabbi Shimon, has, right, etzba goes with sprinkling of the blood. But that was for the sin offering. But in all the other offerings, it just says zarak zarkua kohanim et hadran. It doesn't say etzba. Now, according to the rabbis, that's fine. It says kohen, right? You need right. That's enough. But according to Rabbi Shimon, that's not enough. And what do we know? We've been talking about this all along. Lo palig Rabbi Shimon, right? It says in our Mishna, zarak b'smol pasul, and nobody seems to argue about that. So here you have a problem. If Rabbi Shimon holds that kohen alone does not say you need right, and by zrika, again, of other korbanot, it doesn't say etzba. Only the chatat needs etzba. And it doesn't say yad either, so it doesn't have any word that indicates right, other than kohen, which, according to the rabbis, indicates right. So why does Rabbi Shimon not disagree? To which I mentioned this before. We're going to now get to, we're almost at the end of our daf, a new unique opinion that we didn't see before. We thought Rabbi Shimon only disagreed about Kabbalah, and that was the whole principle, right? That was how Abai said. The pasuk is specifically talking about that, right? But when it comes to other korbanot, we're going to say, Amar Abai palig bebraita. He actually does disagree. He didn't say it in our Mishnah for some reason, but he does disagree in a braita. Kibel b'smol pasul v'Rabbi Shimon machshir. So again, we're talking not about the chata, because that we already proved needs the right hand, according to Rabbi Shimon. But any other korban, the zrika also, if you did it with the left, it's not disqualified. I got to imagine that Rabbi Shimon does think you're supposed to use the right hand, but what he means is that it's not disqualified if you did it with the left. Okay? Zarak b'smol pasul, right? So it says here again, Kibel b'smol pasul Rabbi Shimon machshir, Zarak b'smol pasul Rabbi Shimon machshir. So here you see, he argues over Kabbalah and he argues about zrika. So that resolves that problem. Now we have one last question, and this goes back to not Rabbi Shimon anymore. Okay, so we explained Rabbi Shimon. Let's just review from the Rabbi Bar Chana and Shem name of Rabbi Yochanan. He said, etzba or kuna. We thought maybe both, but then we said, no. Either etzba or kuna means you have to do it with the right. And Rabbi Shimon says, no, etzba means right. Kahuna by itself doesn't mean right, unless it comes with etzba, okay, with finger. Now, then we're now going to say, Elahada amarava, yad yad lekmitza, rega rega lechalitza, ozen ozen leritzia. By the leper, it says, as I mentioned before, you have to put it on boen yado yimanit, boen raglo yimanit, and boen ozno yimanit. And shnuch ozen yimanit. So by each one of these, it said yimani. Now, theoretically, you could have just said it once, and it would be clear all of them are done on the right. So why do I have to say yimani, yimani, yimani 3 times? So they said each is coming to teach you some other halacha that needs to be done with the right hand. So yad yad the kmitza. So it says it by yad to teach you about the yad in the kmitza. The kohen has to do the kmitza with his hand. Also there, he has to use his right hand. Rega rega lechalitza. The regel is a reference to a different place where there's a regel. That's in the chalitza ceremony of the levirate marriage. And there where they don't want to do a levirate marriage, they do chalitza instead. And they have the shoe, and it comes from his right foot. Ozen l'ritzia. That's when you pierce the ear of an Eved Ivri. He wants to stay longer with his master after the 7 years. He's supposed to go free on the 7th year. He wants to stay. Pierce his ear. Which ear? It says Ozen. It says Ozen by the leper. Also must be the right ear. But now here's the question. When he says yad yad l'kmitza, lamali mida Rabbi Bar Chanan nafka. You can learn it from Rabbi Bar Chanan's quote of Rabbi Yochanan, because the kmitza, the only one of these 3 ceremonies, has to be done by a kohen. So once you have kohen, that's all you need. You don't need yad yad. You don't need that drasha. So what's that drasha coming to do? So chad lekometz v'chad lekiddush kometz. We'll finish here. One is for the kometz. That's the kohen does the kmitza, which is takes his 3 fingers, puts it in the dough of the mincha, right? Of the dough that we prepare for the mincha, takes it out. That has to be done with the right hand. That we already learned from the yad because it's the kohen. Kohen has to do it, so we got that. Or it says yad there also. But there's another action, and that wasn't so clear that you need, right? And that is learned from this gzera shavi here, yad the kmitza. It has to be done with the right. That's kiddush kometz. What happens after? So first you put this whole dough of the mincha in a klei sharet. We started with the klei sharet, right? We were talking about that before. So you put it in the sanctified vessel when we talked about the floor and comparing it to a klei sharet. Then you take out the kmitza. The kohen takes out the section which is going to ultimately be burnt on the altar. That goes into another klei sharet. Once the kohen takes it out, he puts that in a sanctified vessel. So that is done with the right hand, and that's what you learned from yad yad. If you just had the first, right, the original reference, it's Kohen doing it, then you would say, oh, that teaches us the kmitza has to be done when he takes out from the dough. That's like the most important part. It's like the shechita. It's parallel to slaughtering in a korban, because there you're separating out what you're going to end up burning on the altar. Then, which the burning on the altar of the kmitza is like the zrikat hadam. Then putting it in the sanctified vessel, you might not have thought it needs right. That you learn the yad yad. Okay, and with that we finish for today. So what did we do? We started with the shnik tuvim b'im kechad. How do you know that the yoshev doesn't get the death penalty, right? If he's treated like a zar, for the purposes his work will be disqualified, maybe he also gets the death penalty, but no, because of the shnik tuvim, or maybe shloshak tuvim. Then we got to the chatzitza, and then we had 3 cases in the Mishna. Why do you need all? First of all, what's the source for the chatzitza being a problem? Number 2, why all 3 cases? And then we got to some weird cases of, 1 foot on, 1 foot on the ground, 1 foot on something else, or if the Evan comes out of place, or maybe that question wasn't even about the Evan come, right? There were 2 ways to understand the question about the Evan coming out of place. And one actually didn't even have to do with chatzitza. Then we got to this big machloka between Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis about the Kabbalah. Could you do it with your left? If we did it with your left hand, would it be disqualified or not? Rabbi Shimon thinks not. What's the basis of their machloket? We had 3 attempts till we finally got to, it must be whether you darshan the pasuk, the word etzba, which comes in between the 2 verbs. Do you darshan it to both, or do you darshan it just to the one after? And then we saw a 3rd position, which you darshan only to the one before. And that would be either only Kabbalah would be disqualified if it's with the left, only Nitina would be disqualified with the left, or maybe both. Then we got to this principle that Rabbi Yochanan says about either etzba or kuna. That tells you right. And then Rabbi Shimon, we said, would have to be etzba only, not kuna. And then we had this question about one second, we ended with, right, what do we do with kohen according to him then in that pasuk, which we answered with kuna. And then we said, what about zrika? Zrika just says kahuna, and we assume Rabbi Shimon disqualifies it, to which we say, surprise, surprise. In a braita, we see that Zrika also doesn't need, but again, that's only Zrika of non-sin offerings. The sin offering already, we saw the Zrika had the word etzba in it, but when it doesn't have the word etzba, then actually even Rabbi Shimon will say it's okay if you did it with your left hand. And we ended with this question on Rava, if we really, question on something Rava said in light of what Rabbi Eliezer quoted of Rabbi Yochanan. How do you deal with that yad yad b'kmitza? You don't need it, which there's two issues of the kmitza. One teaches you, from the word kohen, you already get to one, and from the word, from the yad yad, gzera shava there, you get to the other. Okay, and I'll just remind you, so number one, you can also read flashback. You can also listen to Alana Steinhain on that topic that we talked about on the lefty topic. And I just wanted to remind you, I keep forgetting to say it in class, but we reopened the order for bookmarks. So if you didn't get bookmarks and you want to order them, if you didn't order them the first time, if you didn't receive them and you did order them, you can check with us to make sure that we got your order. And but don't order two if they're on their way. The mail system really isn't great. And then, but if you want to order new ones, we'll send them out again after the Chag. It still might take a while to get to you, but you have till the end of Chag to register to get bookmarks. Okay, wishing everyone a Moadim L'Simcha, Chag Sameach.